Instead of focusing on winning arguments, we're teaching the basic fundamentals of sales and marketing and how we can use them to win in the world of politics, teaching you how to meet people where they're at on the issues they care about. Welcome to The Brian Nichols Show. All right, and with that, returning to The Brian Nichols Show, you know him, you love him, the one and only Brad Polumbo. Welcome back to The Brian Nichols Show.
Hey, thanks for having me back. Am I up there with your most repeated guests?
Absolutely are, my friend. I think you're at number, is this 6? 7?
I don't know.
A lot. Yeah, but I think actually you, beyond Chris and Jeremy, who they cycle back and forth for the sales and marketing shows, I think you are easily far and above the most repeat guests. And it's because, Brad, you always bring so much value to the audience. I'm not even trying to, kiss your butt here. This is I get people who reach out to me and they say, Brian, that episode you had with the economist, I think he's an economist. I'm like, Brad, he's from Fee, but yeah, Brad, he's awesome. They're like, yeah, he was great. I learned so much. And I'm like, yeah, there you go. That's the conversations we're trying to have. So that's why you keep on coming back in the show, my friend.
Well, that's awesome. I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate the work you're doing. And that's why we want to have you on the show again. Obviously, you've been so busy, not only at Fee, as I mentioned, but also at the Washington Examiner. But first, we're going to start off. You wrote an article over at Fee. And it made me laugh because you hear all the doom and gloom that we hear in the world, especially from our friends on the left. And this is what you do all day long, is you address a lot of the doom and gloom with reality. And one of the articles you wrote over at Fee was the progressive politicians predicting these massive tsunamis of evictions after the Supreme Court decided not to go ahead, or rather, they went ahead and ended the CDC eviction moratorium. So, Brad, let's start off. Dig into what is it just a matter of the hysteria seems to be the overarching driving force here from the left, is just to get people terrified that something terrible is going to happen to them? Is that seemingly the language of the left nowadays?
Yeah, well, I don't know about you, Brian, but I consider myself a survivor of the great net neutrality repeal of 2018. I was reliably informed that we were all going to die. The internet would never be the same as we know it. Your
$14.99 for Facebook, Brad.
Like this for the rest of your life. All the stuff that they said about this. I remember during President Trump's tax cut push, and I agreed with most of the tax cut bill, but not all of it. And there were valid criticisms you could make of it. But instead, they decided to say that tax cuts kill people. Yes, Nancy Pelosi literally said that cutting taxes, in this case, removing the Obamacare mandate, would kill people. So the hysteria from people, and there's hysteria on both sides, but in particular when it comes to rolling back government interventions into the economy, it is progressives and the left who are constantly hysterical. And so one of the things that I think is unfortunate is that in our current media ecosystem, they get all these coverage when they issue these warnings or these dire predictions or condemnations of what's going to happen, but very rarely does anybody follow up and see how those have aged. Now, what I decided to do in this case was simply just go back. So for folks, for a little bit of background, in late August, the Supreme Court struck down the CDC's eviction moratorium. What that was an order by the federal agency that's, ostensibly focused on public health and pandemics, basically saying that in the rental market nationwide, landlords could not evict non-paying tenants in many circumstances. It created tons of problems that we can get into potentially, but it was a really drastic intervention, and the Supreme Court struck it down, said that it was unlawful because they really stretched their authority, and they said that you would have needed an act of Congress to do something like this, not just some unelected bureaucrats issuing a mandate. And when the Supreme Court made this decision, there was a meltdown like you've never seen. AOC predicted that there was going to be a secondary pandemic of evictions across the country. Ayanna Pressley, who's a member of the Squad and a congresswoman from Massachusetts, well, she said that there was going to be a tsunami of evictions in a national tent city across the country of people living in tents after they've been thrown out onto the streets. Ed Markey said something like, we're going to see a harmful wave of millions of people thrown out of their homes. He's a senator as well. So what we saw is all these bold claims, but about a month later, we look back And there's not been any change in the eviction rate. Literally, the Washington Post reported this, not some right-wing source, but in most major metropolitan areas in the country, the rate of evictions, the number of evictions, has not noticeably increased since the moratorium expired. The only difference is now people actually have to pay their bills.
Well, we see this recurring theme, and it seems that hysteria sells. And we saw this throughout the entirety of the pandemic. I mean, you mentioned AOC saying a second pandemic, the pandemic of the evictions, and that never came to be. And we saw this, this throughout the entire pandemic. Every single action that was taken in fear of preventing the absolute worst case scenarios. Those worst case scenarios don't really seem to ever really come, Brad. And I think we're seeing right now a lot of people starting to wake up to the fact that a lot of these dire predictions that the quote unquote experts have been making, or that these political bettors have been making, haven't really panned out. Nothing's really coming to fruition. And now they're starting to even question these authorities and these really the infrastructure that we built across the United States, and they're questioning it. And I can you blame them? I mean, honestly, we're getting to the point where your average person is like, let's go, Brandon. Like, yep, that's what they're saying in the crowd. Let's go, Brandon. And you can hear just how forced it is, like, for the media to try to just present it in such a different way than what's actually just right there. And that permeates across so many different areas in life, Brad. And I mean, you see this hysteria. It plays into the article you wrote. It was fantastic over the Washington Examiner, with Biden insulting anyone who disagrees with his $4.5 trillion spending binge. There was one line in particular where he said they're being Democrats, Republicans rather, are about opportunity versus decay. They're about leading the world versus letting us pass by, which is literally happening. To support these investments is to create a rising America. To oppose these investments is to be complicit in America's decline. And that right there, it's that language of this is going to be the worst case scenario, America's decline, if you don't do exactly what we say you're supposed to do. Brad, thoughts?
Yeah, I do find the apocalyptic and alarmist tone just exhausting, because I've been a huge opponent of this massive spending push that they're pursuing, of these multi-trillion tax hikes. But I will sit here and tell you that if all of it passed, the U.S. would not fall apart. Our economy would suffer, but it would not collapse. Right? It wouldn't be disaster. Yet Democrats, in particular, for some reason, seem incapable of talking about policy disagreements or people that disagree with them without just painting these worst case scenarios. So Joe Biden, who we were told was going to be President Unity and norms and civility, first, he's just been gaslighting us. He's been looking the American people in the eye and lying to them and saying that we're going to spend trillions of dollars, but it costs $0. It's like 1984, like war is peace, slavery is freedom, and 3.5 trillion is 0 trillion. I mean, it's
Drew Carey in the beginning of Whose Lines It Anyway, where the points made up and where the rules are made up and the points don't matter. That's right, the points are like, and then he'd give it his little spiel, because that's literally what it is, Brad.
Yeah, but then he went on and said this quote that you just mentioned, the whole thing about being complicit. And he's saying that if you oppose this 4.5 trillion agenda, you are complicit in America's decline. I just think that's a very drastic and unfortunate way to talk about good faith policy disagreements. But if anything, right, Biden's infrastructure plan, the 1.2 trillion transportation infrastructure bill, an analysis from Ivy League researchers at the Wharton School of Business found that it would actually not lead to more jobs, not lead to higher wages, and not lead to economic growth. So he wants to spend trillions for basically zero return on investment. And in doing so, he wants to raise our corporate tax rate so that we would have the third highest corporate tax rate of any developed country in the world, putting us at an enormous economic disadvantage.
Is that bad?
Right?
Yeah.
Tons of businesses will go to other places. And yet he says that we're the ones complicit in America's decline. I don't want to talk like that. But if we're going to, Joe, it's not us who should be worried about that label.
I mean, Brad, come on. We can just go ahead and mint a $1 trillion platinum coin and then poof, all the problems are solved. Duh. That's all it takes.
Yeah. So we should go into this topic, but
I'm sorry, my skin crawls just like, because that's actually a solution that's being presented, and like you say it like that. I'm sorry, like you say it like that, and it sounds so stupid. I said it to my wife. I said this out loud. I said they're gonna print a coin, and she laughed. And then I showed her the article, and she goes, "Oh my god, you're being serious?" I was like, "Yes." She's like, "That? How does this work?" And I'm like, "Exactly. No, it doesn't." Yeah. Dig into the policy. What is the proposal?
Well, the funny thing is, Brian, it's a crazy idea, but it's not impossible. It's not implausible that they could actually do it.
Yeah.
Basically, the idea is that they're running up against a debt limit right now. So the US, unless Congress, Republicans and Democrats can agree to raise the debt limit, in theory, this is never going to happen. They're going to strike a deal. But in theory, the US could default on its debt, which would be really catastrophic for our economy. Nobody wants that to happen, trust me. But one workaround that they're trying to, that some people are pushing, including members of Congress, like I think it was Rashida Tlaib, some of the squad members support hashtag mint the coin. It's an online movement, and they're calling on basically the federal government to mint a coin, assign it a value of $1 trillion, deposit it in the Federal Reserve's accounts, and then use that to fund the government in lieu of additional debt, but then have the Fed offset it. Basically, it's a very bizarre theoretical way you could get around the debt limit and still fund the government without having to default.
It's an IOU. Hold on. Is it basically an IOU? I mean, is that fair to say? They're basically turning this coin into a proverbial future IOU that they will kind of pay back once the value can be acquired?
No. So what they would do is they would create this one.
This is why you're on the show, by the way, Brad, because I was wrong. Just so we're
clear. It's sort of actually indistinguishable from taking out $1 trillion more in debt in the end, because what they would do is take out the 1 trillion coin, mint it, put it in their accounts, and therefore draw from it and spend on it. But then the Fed would sell treasuries to take an exact equivalent amount out of the private economy. So what they would do is, like, some people are like worried, understandably, that printing a 1 trillion coin would cause inflation, but it actually would not, because of the way that they're talking about this proposal is that they're going to print $1 trillion coin, use it to fund the government, but then take $1 trillion out through the Federal Reserve of the private economy. So if they do that, then there's no inflation shock, but then it's literally the same as if you just spent $1 trillion anyway. So it's just a technical workaround from the debt limit that's probably illegal, according to some monetary experts, but they do disagree about this. And also the other big thing is that then the spending power starts to lie with the Fed and the Treasury.
Oh boy.
Unelected bureaucrats rather than our elected officials. And that's a real perversion of our constitutional order, because we can hold our members of Congress accountable, at least in theory, but we can't hold the Fed people or the people at the Treasury Department accountable for how many $1 trillion coins they mint. I mean, it's just a pretty alarming vision of government to have it go down that route.
Fun stuff. And then Janet Yellen wants to go ahead and keep an eye on your bank account, $600 plus, all these great things coming from the Biden administration. Thank you. No mean tweets. So
moderate.
Oh goodness. Yeah. Super moderate. Really, really super duper moderate. Bernie Sanders is singing his praises. Super duper moderate. God, this is just like a nightmare. No, I'm teasing, because I mean, it is insanity to hear this proposal laid out, because it's Charlie from Always Sunny with the big board behind him, all the lines drawn together, because that's how you have to make this accounting work. But it literally is just exactly to your point. It's just doing the $1 trillion
but
in
Brian,
a different way.
It's probably not going to happen. I will say that.
Okay, good.
It's a lot of talk in progressive, like, wonk circles. It's a huge online movement, But from what I've heard, I think Jen Psaki, the White House press secretary, has been asked about it and shot the idea down. I know Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary and former Fed chair, she's in the Biden administration. She was asked about it. She shot the idea down. So while it's disturbing that the progressive movement is pushing an idea like this, we can rest assured that at least in the very short term, it's not going to happen, I don't think. I would say it's pretty unlikely.
Let's hope. How about this? Let's go for the last 10 minutes or so. I want to make sure we focus on this insanity that is the $3.5 trillion spending bill. And I kind of think we're numb at this point to the idea of how much money $3.5 trillion is. It just seems like fun money. It doesn't seem real because it kind of isn't. But Brad, you wrote an article because right now, obviously, Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats are fighting back. They're saying we can't cut anything from this bill because it's super important. Everything is super duper important. And you say, I disagree. And you wrote an article over at Fee, which actually goes ahead and lists off 4 specific areas that Nancy Pelosi could start. Brad, what's number one area that Nancy Pelosi can cut from this $3.5 trillion spending monstrosity?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned about the real cost because that doesn't get talked about enough. For context, like if I just say 3.5 trillion, what does that mean to most people? That's beyond our comprehension. What that means, though, to put it in context, is $24,400 per federal taxpayer in expenditure. It's a lot of money. The other thing that you can think of is you can compare it, and 3.5 trillion is significantly more than the inflation-adjusted costs of FDR's New Deal. So we are talking about an insane sum that's mostly going to what I would honestly call Green New Deal-like climate change schemes and expansions of the welfare state. So there's so many things in here. I rolled my eyes so hard at that comment that Nancy Pelosi made about what could we possibly cut? I'm like, well, Nancy, here are a few things. And this is just scratching the surface. But for example, they have Obamacare subsidies in there that would go to very affluent Americans. You would get tens of thousands of dollars in healthcare subsidies because this would extend the subsidies and also eliminate the income caps. Even if your family is earning up to $400,000, you're still going to get thousands of dollars in taxpayer subsidies. Why don't we start by cutting billions out with that, Nancy?
I mean, that makes sense, but then, that would require Nancy Pelosi to go ahead and actually lead. Number 2, Brad, you went ahead. We talked about this back, a year ago, maybe, when we were talking about canceling student debt. And that's, of course, tossed in here in a roundabout way, and that's giving just people free community college. Free $100 billion of taxpayer money, Brad?
Yeah, I'm pretty against this one as well, because one thing that people don't seem to understand, I'm actually very pro community college. I encourage people to go to community college for 2 years. You won't have to take any debt because that's the thing. It's very inexpensive. It costs about a few $1,000s in tuition per semester in most places before any scholarships or existing aid. So you can pay your way through community college working a minimum wage job, and then maybe go to a state university to finish your bachelor's and avoid a lot of the debt that people are drowning in and then want Big Daddy government to come take away from them. But in this case, they just want to make community college free for all. And there's no such thing as free. So it would cost taxpayers at least $100 billion, which is a huge sum of money. And I say we get rid of that because, like I said, it's already affordable. It's plenty affordable. And 2, the biggest problem facing community colleges right now is low graduation rates and low academic outcomes. And there's been a lot of research into this, but when you have students that don't have skin in the game, they financially, right, their own loans, their own money, their own involvement, if they're just on their parents' money or they're just on the government's money, they don't do as well in school. They're not as dedicated. So that's another reason I feel like that would really exacerbate the existing problems in our community college system. If it was just free, you'd have way more people probably signing up, but even fewer graduating and actually finishing through and getting good grades and going on to do something with it. So I think it's a terrible investment of taxpayer resources and a very easy area to just scrap some room out of this massive budget bill.
You called this big guy here the Green New Deal light, which I thought was very clever, because that's exactly what I was thinking too. And I was reading this one provision about the massive subsidies here for electric vehicles and quote unquote green energy companies, which you so perfectly pointed out, Brad, that this is nothing more than just an overwhelming support of your already rich Americans who have investments in these quote unquote green alternative forms of energy companies.
Yeah, let me just ask you a question, Brian. Have you ever seen a poor person driving a Tesla?
Like what, 6 a day? Negative. No.
Right. I mean, think about for a moment who drives electric cars and what kind of companies create electric cars. The answer is very wealthy people and very liberal groups of people. These are the Democrats' true constituencies. They are corporatist, crony capitalists. They want to funnel huge amounts of taxpayer money to these corporations through these subsidies and to these favored groups of high income earning people because that's their agenda. And they can say it's about climate change. Listen, I believe in climate change. I believe it's a real problem. I do think we should look for ways to reduce our carbon emissions. In particular, nuclear energy is extremely promising and needs to be deregulated. But this would make no difference. I mean, the Cato Institute has done a lot of research on this, but the US, in terms of global carbon emissions, US passenger vehicles account for about 2%. So if you stopped every car on the road, we never drove anything again, you would barely make a single dent in the trajectory of global warming as it's anticipated in the coming decades and century. So it wouldn't make a difference. And now just imagine a small tax, or no, well, a hugely expensive tax credit scheme that would have maybe a small impact on our carbon emissions, but like not even come close to completely eliminating that 2%. And the 2% is already a tiny amount of the global problem. So it's like it's not going to make any noticeable difference, but it will cost $500 billion or something like that in taxpayer money that's going to these companies for subsidies. And it is a really good example of how the Democrats talk a big talk about being progressive and standing for the working class, but they so often use power when they get it to funnel money to well off and well educated and richer constituencies and voters, and then politically favored companies.
Well, we see how great the government is at managing everything we've talked about today. So let's go ahead and talk about number 4, where they're trying to go ahead and manage some more, and that's in our healthcare, of course. And Brad, you go ahead and you outline they're trying to just blow up Medicare. Right now, it's set to hit insolvency in 5 years or so, but they say, hey, we're just going to go ahead and, I guess, pump it full of dollars, and that's going to save it, right?
Yeah, I just can't even imagine this logic. Like, I feel like a toddler with a piggy bank understands this better. With Medicare, the government healthcare program for elderly people, it is already going to hit insolvency in just a few years. They're like, you know what? Let's slap a bunch more expansions into that bad boy. What could go wrong? So they want to push millions more people off of private insurance and onto government insurance by lowering the age of eligibility for Medicare, by expanding it to provide dental and vision and hearing coverage, and all these other ways of expanding this program that would cost billions of dollars. And a lot of these people, so I guess I'm a Gen Zer. I have my share of disagreements and resentments for baby boomers, and maybe this will come through a little bit here. But these elderly people are much wealthier than young people and middle-aged people on average, much wealthier. Yet now we're going to be taxed more and have more of our future borrowed away to pay for their like glasses and their supplemental health care. I mean, even if the budget already wasn't bursting at the seams, this still wouldn't make sense as a matter of redistributional policy.
Brad, we could go on and on, man. But unfortunately, we're already at time. But I think the way we could put the bow on this episode is that it requires us to have this conversation because your average person, we've said this once, we'll say it again. They're not plugged in like this. They're not reading the articles like we are. I mean, I say articles. Your average person doesn't have the time to devote to looking at the news and trying to get like the actual news versus the sensationalism. Factor that into actually reading these gosh darn bills, and you take the time to do this, and then we have you on the show. We try to break it down so your average person not only can try to understand it, but then can better communicate it to people that they see in their circle. So that's why we do what we do. And I gotta thank you, man, because this is really where we're gonna win, is just showing how insane the hysteria has become. And when you're able to raise up the outcomes that didn't happen, right? Because of the cries that, oh my gosh, net neutrality, Elizabeth Warren, we're all gonna die. You want people to die. That was the argument we heard at the beginning of COVID. This is why we have to make sure that we're not only being consistent in making sure that we're answering the questions that people are asking, but we're being consistent in making sure that we're staying true to what we actually believe, because this is what people call out on the BS. They see through the hypocritical, contradictions. They see it, and it's time for us to stop playing defense. Did you get the chance, by the way, really quick, to watch the Ben Shapiro Anna Kasparian debate?
Yeah, I did. I really enjoyed it.
I did too. And she shared something at the end of the debate on Twitter, and it came down to the left having to stand up and be more confident in their ideas, and that she believes that they can win more people over by speaking to more people. And I threw my hands in the air, and I'm like, that is what we have been trying to do here for the Liberty Movement, because that is what works. Just sitting in your little groupthink bubbles and hive mind talking about how great you are and how right you are doesn't actually accomplish anything. If anything, it isolates us from the rest of the real world. So having stories like this that take these sometimes very confusing, very hard to explain, and sometimes very complex issues, breaking it down and making it so your average person can take away not only the meat of the information they need to understand, but also how to convey it. Brad, thank you, my friend. Folks, please do me a favor. Go ahead and support our good friend Brad Polumbo. He has an amazing podcast, Breaking Boundaries, a proud sponsor here on the Brian Nichols Show, but also he does a lot of amazing work over at FEE and at Washington Examiner. Brad, what is on the agenda for Brad Polumbo going forward?
Make sure you're also following my YouTube channel. I'm uploading a lot of videos there. All the podcasts are there in the video version. You can go find Brian's ugly mug if you scroll back far enough in my archive.
Enough of that, Brad. Come on.
Yeah, they probably don't want to do that, but just search Brad Polumbo, Polumbo, to check out my YouTube channel, where I do breakdown videos, reaction videos, long form podcasts with people like Rand Paul. So definitely check that out.
Brad Polumbo, as always, you're busy, my friend, and you're doing great work. I know you were over on the Young Turks yourself more recently. Young Turks, right? You did a debate there, or not really debate, just more of a friendly debate discussion.
It's a debate. Yeah, they have you on for a debate. They grill you.
Yeah, those were good outtakes there. So yeah, folks, make sure you go ahead, follow Brad over on YouTube. But with that being said, Brad Polumbo, as always, thanks for joining the Brian Nichols Show.
Thanks, man.
Thanks for listening to the Brian Nichols Show. Find more episodes at briannicholsshow.com.